In other education-related news, Florida is pushing to educate young minds in the history and dangers of communism. Governor DeSantis signed the anti-communist education bill into law on Wednesday. It will apply to the 2026-27 school year. We discussed this with Nick Zaveri, the co-host of Educate U.S. podcast. Nick, you're just the right person to talk to here. This law is going to teach students the facts about communism, including that 100 million people were victims of regimes from the Chinese Communist Party to that of Communist Cuba to the Soviet Union. Please elaborate on why it's imperative for the youth of this country to grasp this.
You know, it makes a lot of sense to have a curriculum that sort of focuses on that. I'll be honest, though. I mean, knowing it's coming from the state of Florida, there's a rebranding here because, from the state that brought you book bans, right, we're now focusing on anti-communism. So it's, I struggle a little bit with where, Florida's coming on. But that being said, there's a lot of merits to making sure that we're talking very honestly about the history of communism. Some of the data that comes in tells us about, that Gen Z, millennials, people have a little more of a favorable view of communism. And I wonder if it's a case of as an economic principle or as a form of government, because obviously there's a huge difference in understanding either one. So I understand where Florida's coming from. Obviously, historically, with the history of migrants, particularly Cubans in, Miami, there's a lot of sensibility to that. But with considering that it's coming from the current governor of Florida, I do reserve some concerns.
And it is interesting you bring up the so-called book bans. Parents and activists have said that they're not banning books. They're simply just getting these over-sexualized books out of the public schools there. There's a Bay of Pigs survivor and a Vietnam veteran who joined Governor DeSantis at the signing. And the veteran said there are too many professors that are leftists teaching the wrong ideology to our students. Please go into detail about the harms of misrepresenting communism.
Yes, and I would call into question that comment in the sense of, so I'm a college graduate. I did have once a professor that professed actually to having socialist leanings and saying at the start of the class, this is where I'm coming from. If that offends you, by all means, withdraw from the class. Now, I stayed around because I think the content of the class was important. So when we talk about this concern about what's being taught and that there's an agenda that's pro-communism, I would like to see some facts about that. If there's a curriculum out there that's talking about, let's focus on communism in the sense of from a positive standpoint. Forgive me, I apparently have a visitor here. So I'm very curious about that. To me, there is a little bit of a straw man to that argument. Now, having said all that, again, I mentioned before about the data that's telling us that Generation Z and millennials seem to be more favorable. Now, is that because of something they learn in college? Or is it because they're concerned about the challenges of unregulated capitalism and a growing wealth disparity in the United States, both of which, are documented fact. And that's not to say communism is a better response. That's foolish, of course. But it is to say that it is okay to question current systems and look to how there's possible opportunities for improvement.
Well, let's look at here. There's people fleeing communism, and you wonder why, right? People leaving Cuba to come to the United States to get better opportunity. And a little background here, Bay of Pigs was when the 1960s, when about 1,400 Cuban exiles attempted to overthrow the Fidel regime, apparently with the help of the CIA, so that they can get a non-communist state that would be friendly to the United States here. We are out of time, but it was good talking to you. Nick Zaveri, co-host of the Educate U.S. podcast. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your time.